She was thrown to the wolves, but the one who found her was their king. The forest floor was a graveyard of frost and silence. Kira's bare feet had stopped bleeding 3 days ago, which meant the cold had claimed them entirely. She no longer felt pain, only the rhythmic pulse of her own heartbeat, fainter with each dawn that broke through the pine canopy above. The rejection mark on her shoulder had begun to blacken at the edges, a physical manifestation of what the elders had whispered as they cast her out. Defective, pathfinder, cursed. They had called her gift an abomination, the ability to sense destinies not yet written, to see the threads of fate before they manifested. It terrified them. An Omega who could perceive what kings could not was an Omega who could challenge the natural order. So they had stripped her of her rank, severed her from the pack bonds, and left her in the Northwood with nothing but a torn cloak and the certainty that she would not survive the coming winter. 3 weeks had passed since then. The moon hung low tonight, swollen and crimson, casting everything in shades of blood and pearl. Kira had learned to read the lunar cycles as a kind of language. Each phase spoke to her in whispers that no one else could hear. The elders would have called this another sign of her corruption. She called it survival. She had built a shelter from fallen branches and her own cloak, pressed against the rocky face of an outcropping near the river. The water was her only companion now, constant and indifferent. She drank from it, bathed her wounds in it, and sometimes she would sit at its edge and watch her reflection fragment in the current. The woman staring back was hollow, cheekbones sharp as flint, eyes ringed in shadow, lips colorless as bone. Tonight, something had changed. The sensation came first as a vibration through the frozen earth, a tremor that traveled up through her broken feet and into her spine. Kira's exhausted body went rigid. Her Omega instincts screamed in a language older than words. Predator, king, danger. But beneath that primal warning, something else unfurled in her chest. A silver thread of knowing that made her gasp. It was the same sensation that had come before her sister's death, before the avalanche that took her father, before the fire that consumed half their territory, a seeing that transcended the present moment. Someone was dying in these woods, and they carried a destiny vast as a glacier. Kira pulled herself to her feet, her body protesting with the stiffness of the nearly dead. She moved toward the sound, a thrashing deeper in the forest, heavy and desperate. Every rational voice in her mind screamed to hide. She was Omega. She was alone. She was already cursed. But the threads of fate did not lie. She found him in a ravine, half buried in snow, his massive frame twisted at an angle that spoke of a fall. His fur, and he was in his wolf form, a beast of impossible size and terrible beauty, was matted with blood, dark and steaming against the white. His breathing was shallow, rattling. A broken bone protruded through his side, and the wound had begun to fester despite the cold. The moment her eyes found his, they opened. They were silver, like moonlight trapped in ice. And in that moment, every thread of destiny Kira had ever perceived came together into a single blazing point of clarity. This was not just any alpha. This was the alpha, the one the pack had whispered about in fearful tones, whose name had been struck from records, whose very existence was considered a stain on their bloodline. The Banished King. Kira understood in that crystalline moment what her gift had always been trying to tell her. Your rejection is not your ending. It is the beginning of everything. She descended into the ravine without hesitation, her broken feet finding purchase on ice and stone. The wolf's eyes tracked her, and she felt the weight of centuries of power in that gaze, a force that could have torn her apart with a thought. But there was something else there too. Agony, and beneath it, a desperate kind of surrender, as if he had already accepted that this frozen ravine was where he would die. Kira knelt beside him, and the moonlight caught the edge of something hanging from his neck, a medallion of black iron marked with symbols she recognized from the oldest prophecies. the mark of a king who had broken his own law, a king who had chosen mercy over dominion. "Don't," he whispered, his voice a rasp of what must have once been terrifying. "Don't waste yourself on a dying thing." Kira's hand moved to the wound, and power she didn't know she possessed began to rise in her blood. It burned like starlight, like salvation, like rebellion. "I am not wasting myself," she said quietly. "I am choosing." And there, beneath the crimson moon, the Omega who had been cast out and the Alpha King who had been hunted began their trade, one freedom surrendered, one destiny embraced. Neither could have known that this moment would rewrite not just their fates, but the very laws that had condemned them both. The forest bore witness, the moon watched, and the blood pooled dark against the white, staining everything sacred. The king had a name, Ezra, though she learned it only by accident when delirium pulled it from his throat on the third night of his fever. Kira had dragged him to her shelter using strength she didn't know an Omega could possess. Every movement sent fresh agony through her broken feet, but the pain had become distant, almost abstract. What mattered was the massive frame of silver-furred wolf she had committed to keeping alive, and the strange power that pulsed through her hands whenever she touched him. The medallion around his neck had grown warm against her skin. She had removed it to examine the wounds more closely and found herself unable to put it back on him. It felt like a violation of something sacred. So she wore it instead, hidden beneath her reconstructed cloak, and felt it thrumming against her heart like a second pulse. His transformation back to human form happened on the fourth night. She had been holding snow to the wound, trying to keep the infection at bay, when his body convulsed and reformed, the massive wolf collapsing into the muscled frame of a man covered in scars that told stories of power and suffering in equal measure. Kira had modestly turned away, wrapping him in her cloak and the furs she had salvaged from her previous attempts at survival. When he finally stilled, consciousness seemed to slip away from him entirely, leaving only the shallow breathing and occasional murmurs of a body trying desperately to heal. "Ezra," she whispered to the darkness, testing the name. It tasted like ancient things, like crowns. On the sixth day he opened his eyes, the silver still there, but now holding something else, awareness. And beneath it, shame so profound it made her chest ache. "Why?" His voice was paper-thin, fractured. Why would an Omega tend to a dying Alpha? Kira was sitting by the small fire she had managed to coax into being from damp wood and desperation. The smoke curled between them, a veil neither could quite see through. She considered lying. Instead, she told him the truth. "Because I am not what they told you I am, and you are not what they told me you were." His eyes closed, and for a moment she thought the fever had taken him again. But then he laughed, a sound like breaking ice. "They cast you out too." It was not a question. "Yes." "For what crime?" Kira poked at the fire, watching sparks rise toward the smoke hole in the shelter's ceiling. "For seeing things they were afraid to understand. For possessing a gift they deemed unnatural." When Ezra was quiet for a long moment, she felt his gaze on her, heavy with the weight of recognition. A pathfinder. The word hung between them, and she understood that he had not spoken it in condemnation. He had spoken it with something far more dangerous, hope. "The elders said it was a corruption," she said softly. "The elders are cowards who mistake uncertainty for evil." His voice was gaining strength now, each word more defined. "I was hunted for the same reason. I would not execute an Omega who had bonded with a wolf deemed lesser. I called mercy a king's duty. They called it treason." Kira turned to look at him fully. In the firelight, his scars gleamed like a map of battles, some won, many lost. His eyes were fever-bright but aware, and she could feel the raw power beneath his skin. dampened now by wounds, but far from extinguished. "How long?" she asked. "How long have you been running?" "2 winters, alone. Hunted." He shifted slightly, and she heard the hitch of pain. "Until tonight, I believed I would die that way." Something twisted in her chest, not quite love, not yet, but something approaching recognition. The threads of fate had brought them together in a ravine at moonrise, and now they were wound so tightly she could not imagine pulling them apart without tearing something fundamental. "You won't," she said. It was not a promise. It was a declaration written in the language of destiny itself. Ezra's hand moved slowly from beneath the furs, reaching toward her. She did not pull away. When his fingers found the medallion beneath her cloak, he went very still. "You wear my mark." "It seemed safer with me." His laugh this time was different, tinged with something that might have been wonder. "Nothing is safe, Kira. Nothing has been safe since the moment you chose to save me." He withdrew his hand, but she could feel the intensity of his attention. "Now they will hunt us both, and this time they will hunt together." The fire crackled between them, and Kira understood the weight of what she had accepted. She was no longer simply an exile in the forest. She was bound now to a fallen king, and that bond would make her the target of every law her pack had ever written. She was no longer running from her rejection. She had chosen to run towards something far more dangerous, a destiny that 2 broken souls might reshape together beneath a moon that watched and waited to see if redemption was possible for those deemed irredeemable. "Then we run," she said simply, "but not tonight. Tonight you heal." And Ezra, the banished king, for the first time in 2 winters, allowed himself to be cared for by someone other than the dying embers of his own defiance. The fever broke on the 9th day, but something else rose with it, a power in the air that made Kira's skin hum and her breath come shallow. She had been preparing herb broth over the fire when Ezra's body went rigid. His eyes flew open, and they were no longer silver. They were white, completely white, as if all the light of the moon had poured directly into his skull. When he spoke, his voice harmonized with itself, layered with something ancient and terrible. "She is coming. The Pathfinder. She is coming." Kira froze, the wooden spoon suspended between the pot and her lips. "Ezra!" His body convulsed, and for a moment she thought the fever had returned with renewed vengeance. But this was different. This was something else entirely, something that made the very air crystallize around them, and the fire burn a peculiar shade of violet. "The seers sent her," he gasped. They felt the disruption. A pathfinder and a fallen king, bound by blood and choice. It unmakes their prophecies. They cannot allow it. Understanding crashed through Kira like an avalanche. The elders had not simply exiled her because they feared her gift. They had exiled her because her gift threatened the fundamental structure of their power. A pathfinder could see beyond the threads they had woven, could perceive alternatives to the destinies they had written. And a pathfinder bound to a king, especially one who believed in mercy over dominion, was an apocalypse they could not tolerate. "Then we leave," Kira said, moving to gather what little they possessed. "Tonight. Now." But Ezra's hand caught her wrist, and his grip was gentle despite its strength. The white was fading from his eyes, leaving them silver once more. But now they held an intensity that burned. "No, this ends here. This ends now. Ezra, listen to me." He pulled himself upright, each movement clearly costing him, but his voice had regained the authority of a king. "Your gift. Tell me what you see when you look at me." Kira's breath caught, because the truth was, she had been seeing something all along, something she had not dared to articulate, even to herself. "Destiny," she whispered. "I see. A crown unmade, a kingdom that never was. But also—" She paused, searching for the words. "I see a path, a choice, a moment where everything breaks or transforms. Ezra released her wrist and took her face gently in both hands. In the firelight, his scars seemed to glow, and she realized they were not marks of defeat. They were runes, ancient symbols written in his own flesh, each one a story of sacrifice. "Your gift is not a corruption," he said softly. "It is a mirror, and what it shows is that mercy is not weakness. It is the only true strength left in this world." Then his lips found hers, and the medallion around her neck burned so intensely she thought it might melt through her skin. The fire exploded upward in a pillar of gold and silver light, and for a moment she could see everything. All the threads of fate, all the possible futures, all the choices that had led them to this ravine, this fire, this kiss. When the light faded, Kira understood. Her gift had not been trying to tell her that she was cursed. It had been trying to tell her that she was necessary. "We face them together," Ezra said. "At dawn, they will come. The seers, the hunters, the kings who fear that mercy might triumph over tyranny, and we will show them that redemption is not a weakness." Kira pulled back slightly, her hands still on his shoulders. "You're not healed. You can barely stand." "I don't need to stand," he replied, and there was something almost like joy in his voice, the joy of a man who had finally found a reason worth dying for. "I need only to show them that an Omega's gift and a fallen king's defiance can rewrite the laws they have carved in blood and bone." The night deepened around them. Kira sat beside Ezra through the remaining hours of darkness, and together they spoke of things that had never been spoken aloud in a world obsessed with hierarchy and dominion. They spoke of a kingdom where gifts like hers were not feared, but honored. Of a world where an Omega could be valued as an equal, not as a subordinate. Of power redefined as the capacity to choose mercy. When the first pale fingers of dawn broke through the forest canopy, Kira could hear them, the distant howls of the hunters. They were coming with numbers and fury and the absolute certainty that they were saving their world from corruption. And in the small shelter, warmed by a fire that burned in colors that should not exist, a pathfinder and a banished king prepared to show them that some corruptions were actually transformations, that some exiles were actually awakenings, and that redemption, once begun, could not be stopped by fear alone. And now I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel and at what moments of the night they find you. They came like a storm. 3 kings, each one armored in fur and fury, their forms towering above the forest floor. Behind them, a dozen warriors in human shape, carrying weapons blessed in moonlight and written with wards meant to bind the unfaithful. The seers walked between them, their eyes wrapped in silver cloth, seeing through means that had nothing to do with sight. Kira stood with Ezra at the mouth of the shelter, and she was no longer afraid. This understanding had come to her in the deep silence before dawn. Fear was a luxury only those with something to lose could afford. She had already lost everything. Her pack, her identity, her place in a world that had deemed her unfit for existence. Anything that happened now was a gain, not a loss. Ezra stood beside her, still bearing the weight of his wounds, but carrying himself with the full authority of the crown they had taken from him. The medallion hung openly now, visible and defiant, marking him for what he was, a king who had chosen a different path and would face consequences for that choice. "Ezra, son of the fallen line," the first king called out, his voice a bass rumble that shook loose snow from the branches above. "You have hidden long enough. Return to the capital, face the council, and perhaps there is clemency in the mercy you claim to value." It was a trap, exquisitely baited. Kira could see it in the way the seers turned their rapt faces toward them, as if leaning in to hear a confession. Ezra stepped forward, and Kira moved with him, their hands finding each other. "There is no clemency for those who believe that power should serve the powerless," he said. His voice was calm, philosophical. "And there is no mercy in your offer. I read the threads of this future, the capital, the council, the trial that is already written in your minds. Execution, slow and ceremonial." The second king snarled, his form already beginning to shift, fur rippling across his shoulders. "Then you choose death here, far from your kingdom, with only an Omega whore to witness your fall." The insult was calculated. It was meant to wound, to provoke, to shatter the unity that Kira and Ezra had built. It nearly worked. She felt Ezra's hand clench, felt the rage coiling beneath his skin like a snake preparing to strike. But Kira squeezed his hand gently, and she felt the moment he chose differently. "She is no whore," Ezra said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "She is a pathfinder. She sees destinies that your seers, for all their power, cannot perceive. And this is what she has seen. A world where the hierarchy you have built crumbles, not because it is challenged from below, but because its foundations were always constructed on lies." The seers moved then, their rapt faces turning in perfect unison, and Kira felt the assault, a pressure in her mind like the weight of a glacier. They were trying to pierce her gift, to see what she could see, to determine if she was truly a threat or merely corrupted by proximity to a fallen king. Instead of fighting, Kira opened herself to them completely. She let them see everything, the threads of all possible futures, branching and rebranching with each choice, each moment, each compassionate or cruel decision. She showed them the futures where Ezra was executed, and the pack celebrated, and the same corruption they feared simply took new forms, wearing different faces. She showed them futures where mercy was viewed as weakness, and the hunger for dominion grew until it consumed everything, including those who wielded it. And she showed them a third path. In this vision, the medallion that hung around Ezra's neck was placed not in a mausoleum, but in a temple where Omegas walked with kings as equals, where a gift like hers was studied and honored, not feared, where the very meaning of strength was rewritten to include the capacity for compassion. The seers screamed. It was not a sound of rage. It was the sound of their entire worldview fracturing at the moment of contact with a truth they had worked so hard to suppress. The wrapped cloth over their eyes began to smoke, and they stumbled backward, their connection to their own power severed. The third king, the eldest, did not move to attack. Instead, he removed his crown, an ancient circlet of silver and bone, and placed it on the ground between them. "I remember mercy," he said quietly. "In my youth, before the seers convinced me that strength required cruelty, I remember believing that an Omega could be valued, that power meant protection, not domination." He looked directly at Ezra, and his eyes held the weight of decades. "Perhaps you are right. Perhaps we have built something that devours itself." The other kings turned on him, but he simply shook his head and walked away, back toward the forest, leaving his crown behind like an offering. The remaining hunters, seeing their eldest defect, began to falter. And in that moment of uncertainty, Ezra made a choice that would echo through the ages. He did not claim victory. He did not take the moment to crush those who would have crushed him. Instead, he knelt, and he extended his hand toward the fallen kings with an expression of such profound compassion that even they could see it was genuine. "Join us," he said simply. "Help us build something new. Not a kingdom where Omegas serve kings, but a kingdom where all beings serve a purpose higher than their own dominion." The warriors dispersed like morning mist. Some returned to the capital to carry word of what had transpired. Others, 3, then 5, then a dozen, remained and knelt beside Ezra and Kira, swearing allegiance not to a king, but to an ideal. And Kira understood, in that crystalline moment, that this was the real prophecy her gift had been showing her all along. Not a love story, though love was part of it, but a revolution written not in blood, but in the transformation of hearts that had been taught to fear difference and were now learning to embrace it. The medallion around her neck cooled finally, its heat replaced by a steady warmth, like the beating of a heart that had finally found its rhythm. Winter deepened, and so did their numbers. News traveled through the territories like frost creeping across a frozen lake. An Omega Pathfinder and a banished king had not been destroyed. They had been transfigured. And in the hearts of those who had always sensed that something was fundamentally broken in the hierarchy, hope began to take root. They came in small groups, an Omega warrior from the Eastern Territories, scarred for defending a younger pack member. A wolf-born noble from the South who had questioned the bloodline laws and been demoted for it. A seer from the capital, one of the younger ones, whose gift had shown her the same futures Kira had revealed to her elders. Each one brought a story of suppression, and each story strengthened the nascent movement Ezra and Kira were building. But the capital was not sleeping. Kira saw it first in her visions, the gathering storm, the acceleration of a plan that had been set in motion the moment word reached the throne. They were preparing an offense not of warriors, but of law. They were writing new edicts, burning old records, preparing to reframe what had happened in the ravine as a corruption that needed to be excised from the collective memory. "They're scared," Kira said to Ezra one evening, as they stood on the ridge overlooking the valley that had become their sanctuary. Snow fell gently around them, and the world was wrapped in that peculiar silence that only deep winter could create. "Fear is making them reckless." Ezra's hand found the small of her back, a gesture that had become familiar, not quite romantic, but carrying the weight of profound trust. Fear is the only thing that can drive them to act. For decades, I watched them rule through certainty that the hierarchy was correct, that strength required domination, that mercy was weakness. He paused, watching the snow accumulate on the valley floor below. "Now they are uncertain, and uncertainty makes predators desperate." "How do we respond?" Kira asked. Ezra was quiet for a long moment. The medallion he had given her to wear hung between them like a third presence, a symbol that had already begun to mean different things to different people. To the capital, it was a mark of corruption. To those who had begun to gather in the valley, it was a beacon of something new. "We do not respond with force," he said finally. "That is what they expect. That is what would validate their narrative, a fallen king leading an army of the discontented against the throne. We do not give them that victory." Then what? Ezra turned to face her fully, and in the moonlight, his scars seemed to form a language all their own. "We respond with the one thing they have no defense against, the truth spoken so clearly that even their propaganda cannot distort it." When the embassy arrived 3 days later, no one expected it to carry a proposal of peace. The messenger was a high seer, one of the most respected voices in the capital. She came alone, wrapped in cloth the color of ash, her eyes uncovered, a sign of respect in their culture, a willingness to be seen completely. "They offer terms," she announced, standing in the makeshift hall that had been carved into the mountainside. "Return to the capital, stand for trial. Surrender the Pathfinder to the Council for study and evaluation." The valley erupted, voices rose in anger, in defiance, but Kira, standing beside Ezra, felt something else entirely. She felt the moment the High Seer's eyes found hers, and in that moment she understood. This was a test. The seer was not here to demand submission. She was here to see what choice they would make, and that choice would determine everything that came next. Ezra rose to his feet. "Tell them this," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I will return to the capital, but not as a prisoner. I will stand for trial, but not before a jury that has already decided my guilt. And Kira, She will choose her own path, not be claimed as property for study." The seer smiled then, a gesture so unexpected that the entire assembly fell silent. "I was hoping you would say that," she said quietly, "because I too have seen the visions that your Pathfinder carries, and I have seen the price of maintaining the old order. The throne sent me to discover if you were truly a threat or merely a symptom." She bowed, the gesture carrying profound respect. "You are not a threat. You are a cure. And some of us in the capital have been waiting a long time for healing to begin." The capital was a city of white stone and silver spires, built in the valleys between mountains that had witnessed the rise and fall of 1,000 kingdoms. Kira had never seen anything like it, and the sight of it filled her with a strange mixture of hope and dread. Ezra had insisted on walking into the throne room without armor, without weapons, carrying only the medallion that had become a symbol of their movement. Behind him walked Kira, not as a prisoner or a possession, but as his equal. Behind them came the High Seer, and 5 others from the capital who had begun to understand that the old ways were crumbling from within. The throne room was vast, built to dwarf those who entered. But as Ezra walked toward it, Kira felt something shift. The space that was meant to intimidate seemed instead to shrink, unable to contain the quiet certainty that radiated from him. The Council of Kings sat in a semicircle, their forms radiating the accumulated power of centuries. But one chair sat empty, the throne itself, which had been vacant since Ezra's banishment. "You return," the eldest king spoke, his voice carrying the weight of the law itself. "The council appreciates your compliance. However, your terms are rejected. You will stand trial for the crime of mercy shown to the lesser-born. Your Pathfinder will be remanded into our custody for evaluation and potential re-education." Kira stepped forward before Ezra could respond. Every instinct was screaming at her to bow, to submit, to accept the hierarchy that had been written in law and blood. But the medallion burned against her skin, and with it came the clarity that all true power came from choice, not from coercion. "I refuse," she said simply. The silence that followed was absolute. A lesser being had never spoken against the council. The very act was considered impossible. The hierarchy was so ingrained that resistance was not merely illegal, it was theoretically impossible for a subordinate to even conceive. "You refuse?" The eldest king rose to his feet, and his fury was palpable, a pressure in the air like a thunderstorm gathering above a mountain peak. "You dare." "I dare," Kira replied, and she could feel Ezra beside her, his presence a counterweight to the king's rage. "I dare, because my gift has shown me something that terrifies you, that this order, this hierarchy that has ruled for centuries, is built on a foundation so fragile that it crumbles the moment anyone questions it. I dare because I am not inferior, I am simply different, and difference, in your system, is defined as threat." She took a step forward toward the circle of kings. "You offer me re-education. But I do not need to be educated. I need to be heard. We all do. Every omega you have deemed lesser, every gift you have deemed corrupted, every voice you have silenced, we need to be heard." The eldest king's form began to shift, rage transforming him into his true nature, a massive beast of muscle and fury. But before he could complete the transformation, the High Seer moved between him and Kira. "If you strike her, you strike me," the seer said quietly. "And through me, you strike those in the capital who have begun to understand what your fear has been hiding." The king froze mid-transformation, caught between rage and the sudden uncertainty of his position. And in that moment of hesitation, Kira saw it, the crack in the armor of power. All their authority was predicated on absolute certainty, on the knowledge that none would dare resist. But now, resistance had occurred, and the entire structure began to wobble. Ezra stepped beside Kira, and he spoke with the voice of a king who had learned the true meaning of strength. "I claim the throne," he said, and the words echoed through the chamber like thunder. "Not as your conqueror, but as your alternative. I claim it in the name of those who have been deemed lesser. I claim it with the understanding that power exists only to serve those it claims to protect. And I claim it with a pathfinder at my side, not beneath my foot, but equal in every way." The other kings rose. For a moment, Kira believed that violence would consume them all. But the High Seer and those with her did not flee. They stood firm, and in their firmness, a choice was presented to every being in that chamber. They could cling to a dying order, or they could choose transformation. One by one, the kings knelt, not to Ezra as a superior, but to the ideal he represented. By the time the final king had bowed, tears were streaming down faces that had never known shame, like if you believe rejection can become destiny. The first law written under Ezra's reign was not a proclamation of conquest. It was a declaration that every being, regardless of rank or gift, possessed inherent worth and the right to determine their own path. The second law abolished the Council of Seers, replacing it with an assembly of all voices, including Omegas and the lesser-born who had previously been denied platforms. It was a revolution written not in blood, but in the restructuring of power itself. But transformation did not come easily. There were those in the territories who refused to acknowledge the new order. Pockets of resistance formed in the frozen wastes beyond the mountains, kingdoms that would not bow to a throne ruled by an Omega's council. And Kira, in her visions, could see the storms building on the horizon, conflicts that would test whether mercy could hold its ground against those who still believed that strength required the subjugation of others. 6 months after claiming the throne, Ezra sat in what had been the council chamber and was now a space where decisions were made collectively. Kira was beside him, no longer as his companion, but as his partner in governance. The medallion hung between them, a symbol that had begun to mean something entirely new, not a mark of corruption, but of redemption. "The territories in the north are preparing for war," Kira told him, and her voice carried the weariness of one who had glimpsed so many possible futures that each one felt equally real. "They will not accept what we are building." Ezra's hand found hers across the table where countless new laws were being drafted. "Then we show them that what we are building is not weakness," he said. "We show them that a kingdom that chooses compassion is not softer. It is stronger because it is built on the voluntary choice of its people, not their coercion." "Some of them will not choose," Kira whispered. "I know," Ezra replied, "and we will face that cost. But we will face it knowing that we chose a path of our own making, not one written for us by those who profit from our division." Kira closed her eyes and extended her gift outward, perceiving the threads of fate that would lead them toward confrontation. But mixed among the threads of violence and conflict, she could see something else: new patterns, new possibilities, new futures being written by beings who had never been allowed to write before. It was messy, it was imperfect, but it was real. On the night of the winter solstice, 1 year after Kira had found a wounded stranger in the ravine, they stood together on the highest tower of the capital, watching the moon rise over a kingdom forever changed. The medallion that had brought them together hung on a chain of silver, worn by neither of them but displayed in the great temple below, where all could see it and understand its meaning. It was not a symbol of power held by one individual, but a reminder that redemption was possible for those willing to pay its price. "Do you regret it?" Ezra asked, and his voice carried the vulnerability of a man who was no longer protected by the armor of a crown. "Everything you sacrificed to save me in that ravine?" Kira turned to face him fully. The rejection mark on her shoulder had transformed over the months, no longer a symbol of exile, but of metamorphosis. Her feet, once broken, were steady beneath her. And her gift, once deemed a corruption, was now understood to be what the kingdom had desperately needed. "I regret nothing," she said. Because my gift showed me that day in the ravine what was possible, and I chose to believe in that possibility. She stepped closer, and the moonlight caught the edge of something shining on her hand, a ring of iron, simple and ancient, the kind worn by those who had chosen to bind themselves not through law or hierarchy, but through pure choice. "Every Alpha King carries a wound," Ezra whispered, reciting the old prophecy that had always meant something different than they had been taught. "Every Omega was born to heal one." "No," Kira replied gently. "We healed each other. We are both Omega and Alpha, both wounded and healed, both broken and whole." And as the moon climbed higher in the winter sky, the medallion in the temple below began to glow with a light that had nothing to do with reflected moonlight. It was the glow of transformation completed, of a revolution that had not destroyed the old order, but transfigured it from within. Of two beings who had been deemed unfit and unsuitable, who had instead become the architects of something entirely new. The kingdoms in the territories continued to resist. There would be conflicts ahead, losses and victories measured not in conquered lands, but in transformed hearts. But in the capital, beneath the eternal flame that burned in the temple where the medallion hung, a new era had begun. And it had begun with an Omega's gift and a fallen king's capacity to choose mercy when cruelty would have been easier. It had begun in a ravine, beneath a crimson moon, when someone deemed broken chose to save someone deemed fallen, and discovered that redemption was not a reward for the worthy. It was the only true path forward. If your heart beat alongside ours, like, comment, and subscribe, because every soul that joins our moon keeps the flame of redemption alive. End of She Traded Her Freedom to Save a Wounded Stranger in the Woods. He was the Banished Alpha King.